Jake, a daring boy from a small town, has a near-death experience after falling from an abandoned warehouse rooftop. He encounters Jesus, who reveals a powerful message about the world's crossroads, unity and vigilance, and shows him visions involving Donald Trump as a pivotal figure. Jake's return inspires him to share his divine message of faith and hope, igniting a movement of love and change in his community and beyond. Jake was always the fearless one, the kind of kid who seemed born for adventure. With his tousled hair, scraped knees, and ever-present grin, he had a knack for turning the most mundane corners of his small town into thrilling escapades. His friends, while less daring, couldn't resist his magnetic enthusiasm, often finding themselves swept up in his wild ideas. Today was no different. The sun hung high in the clear blue sky as Jake and his small group of friends wandered the outskirts of town. This part of the neighborhood, long forgotten by adults, was a paradise for kids like Jake. Abandoned warehouses and graffiti-covered walls hinted at a bygone era, now transformed into a playground of crumbling bricks and rusted metal. "We've been everywhere except there," Jake said, pointing at a dilapidated building in the distance. Its brick walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and vines crept up its sides like fingers trying to reclaim the structure. To Jake, it was perfect. "Are you serious?" his friend Adam asked, squinting up at the building. "That thing looks like it could fall over any second." "It's fine," Jake replied, waving off the concern. "We'll just climb to the top, check out the view, and come back down. You'll thank me later." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew Jake wasn't easily deterred. "You're crazy, you know that?" Sarah muttered, adjusting her backpack nervously. "Crazy is fun," Jake shot back with a grin. "Come on, don't be scared." Without waiting for a response, Jake jogged toward the building, his sneakers kicking up small clouds of dust. The others followed reluctantly, their apprehension growing with every step. When they reached the base, Jake tilted his head back, scanning the weathered ladder bolted to the side. It groaned under his grip as he gave it a test shake. "See? Solid as a rock," he said, though the creak of rusted metal suggested otherwise. "Just follow me." Jake began his ascent, his hands gripping the worn rungs with practiced ease. His friends hesitated, exchanging nervous looks. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah whispered. Adam sighed. "If we don't, he'll never let us hear the end of it." One by one, they followed Jake, their hearts pounding with every creak and groan of the ladder. By the time they reached the roof, their nerves were frayed, but the view made it almost worth it. The entire town sprawled out below them, bathed in golden sunlight. The rooftops stretched endlessly, the church steeple standing tall against the horizon. Jake stood at the edge of the roof, arms outstretched, his face lit with triumph. "See? I told you it was worth it." Sarah and Adam lingered near the center of the roof, well away from the edge. "Yeah, great view," Adam muttered, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Now can we go back down?" But Jake wasn't listening. Ever the thrill seeker, he edged closer to the precipice, his sneakers skidding slightly on the loose gravel. "Come on, you guys are such chickens. It's perfectly safe." "Jake, seriously, stop messing around," Sarah called out, her voice tinged with genuine fear. Jake turned to face them, his grin as wide as ever. "Relax, I've got this." But in that moment, his foot landed on an unstable patch of gravel. It shifted beneath him, and his body lurched forward. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as Jake's arms flailed, desperately reaching for balance that wouldn't come. His friends' screams echoed in his ears as gravity pulled him downward. The world blurred into a swirl of motion. Sky, brick, ground, until it all went black. The last thing Jake remembered was the panicked faces of his friends disappearing above him, swallowed by the rushing wind and the crushing inevitability of the fall. Jake's first sensation was silence, not the absence of sound, but a profound, all-encompassing stillness that filled the air and vibrated deep within his soul. He opened his eyes, or at least he thought he did. The world around him was unlike anything he had ever seen. There was no sky, no ground, no horizon, only an infinite expanse of soft, glowing light. It wasn't blinding. Instead, it seemed to wrap around him like a warm embrace, soothing the ache he hadn't even realized was there. Panic rose briefly in his chest as he tried to make sense of his surroundings, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm. The fear, the pain, the sharp memory of his fall, all of it melted away, leaving only peace. "Where am I?" he thought, his voice echoing in the stillness. It wasn't a sound but a thought, projected outward into the glowing void. As if in response, the light began to shift and swirl, forming shapes that defied logic or description. Jake's heart raced, not in fear, but in awe. He felt himself being drawn forward, though he couldn't see what was pulling him. It wasn't a force he could resist, nor one he wanted to. The light around him began to take form, morphing into a landscape of unimaginable beauty. The ground beneath his feet shimmered like polished gold, though it felt soft and alive underfoot. The air was filled with music, not like anything he had heard before, but soft, melodic tones that resonated deep within him, filling him with an indescribable joy. Flowers bloomed in colors he didn't know existed, their petals glowing faintly as if lit from within. Jake turned in circles, taking it all in. He noticed figures moving in the distance. They weren't solid or distinct, but radiated a warmth and kindness that brought tears to his eyes. They glided, almost floating, their forms glowing with an otherworldly light. Jake instinctively knew they weren't strangers. These beings knew him, loved him in a way that was deeper and more complete than anything he had experienced before. One figure stepped forward, brighter and more defined than the others. Jake's breath caught as he felt its gaze, not piercing, but all-encompassing, seeing every part of him, even the parts he had tried to hide from himself. The figure didn't speak, but Jake felt its presence, as if it were inviting him closer. The warmth that emanated from the figure was overwhelming, and Jake found himself stepping forward instinctively. As he did, he noticed the others beginning to gather, forming a circle around him. Their light wasn't harsh, it was comforting, like a fire on a cold night. It was as if they were welcoming him home. Before Jake could ask any questions, a voice filled the space around him. It was unlike any voice he had ever heard. Powerful, yet gentle, commanding yet overflowing with compassion. It didn't come from one direction, it was everywhere, resonating through every fiber of his being. "Jake," the voice said, his name carrying a weight that made his knees weak. He turned and froze. Before him stood a presence so radiant, so utterly pure, that he could hardly comprehend it. The light that surrounded the figure wasn't merely bright, it was alive, pulsating with energy and love. Jake wanted to look away, but he couldn't. It wasn't fear that held him, it was awe. "You are not alone," the voice continued. "You are here for a purpose." Jake's lips trembled as he tried to speak. Who are you?" he finally managed to whisper. The figure smiled, a smile that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe, filled with infinite love and understanding. Jake didn't need an answer in words. He knew. This was Jesus, not as a painting or a statue had shown him, but as a living presence, more real than anything Jake had ever experienced. The peace that had enveloped Jake when he first arrived intensified, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a knowing. He belonged here. He was loved here. Every doubt, every fear, every pain he had ever carried was stripped away in the presence of this light. "You have a life yet to live," Jesus said, his voice filled with a love so profound it brought Jake to his knees. Tears streamed down Jake's face as he felt the weight of those words. "But there is something you must see," Jesus continued, "something you must understand before you return." "Return?" The thought of leaving this place was almost unbearable, yet Jake nodded, his heart swelling with both fear and trust. He didn't know what he was about to see, but he felt as though his entire existence had been leading up to this moment. Jesus reached out, his hand resting gently on Jake's shoulder. The warmth of his touch was overwhelming, a surge of love and strength that seemed to flow through Jake's very being. The light around them began to shift once more, the golden landscape dissolving into something new. Jake felt himself being drawn into the vision, the world around him swirling into shapes and colors. His heart raced as the peace of the golden light faded, replaced by a sense of anticipation. He didn't know where he was going, but he trusted that he was exactly where he needed to be. The journey ahead was about to begin. The golden light around Jake dissolved, replaced by a swirling tapestry of colors and images. At first, the scenes moved too quickly for him to process. Flashes of people, places, and events blurring together in a kaleidoscope of motion. Then, gradually, the images slowed, and Jake found himself standing in a vast, ever-changing landscape. It wasn't like the peaceful, glowing realm he had just left. This place was dynamic, alive with movement. Cities, towns, and vast stretches of countryside appeared before him, as though he were gazing at the entire world all at once. The ground beneath him shifted, morphing into streets, forests, and oceans as the scenes played out. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. Life on Earth, unfolding in real time. He saw people laughing and embracing, communities working together, and families celebrating simple joys. There was love, unity, and hope radiating from these moments. Jake felt his heart swell as he watched, a warmth spreading through his chest. But just as quickly, the scene shifted. The laughter was replaced by shouts, the celebrations by chaos. Fires burned in the streets, their smoke curling into the sky like dark tendrils. People argued, their faces twisted with anger. Jake saw divisions, friends turning against each other, families breaking apart, leaders standing at podiums, their faces etched with stress and fear. Jake's stomach churned as the scenes grew darker. He turned to Jesus, who stood beside him, his presence steady amidst the chaos. "What's happening?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "The world is at a crossroads," Jesus said, his tone calm yet heavy with sorrow. "There is much good, much hope, but there are also forces at work, forces that seek to divide, to corrupt, and to lead many astray." Jake swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the scenes of hope and despair. "What can I do?" he asked. "I'm just a kid." Jesus smiled gently, his eyes filled with love. Sometimes, the smallest voices carry the greatest truth. What you have seen, what you will share, can inspire others to reflect and act with faith, love, and vigilance. As Jesus spoke, the shifting images began to focus, narrowing in on a single figure. Jake saw a man standing in a large room, surrounded by people. Some were advisors, others strangers Jake didn't recognize. Their faces reflected a mix of emotions: concern, determination, and in some cases, cunning. Jake's breath caught as he realized who the man was: Donald Trump. Even as a young boy, Jake recognized the former president from news stories and discussions he had overheard from adults. Trump stood at the center of the room, his expression a mixture of confidence and burden, as though he carried an invisible weight. "Why are you showing me him?" Jake asked, turning to Jesus. "Because he plays a pivotal role in what is to come," Jesus replied. "He has been given influence over many, and his decisions ripple across the world. But with great influence comes great responsibility. The path he walks is not easy. There are those who seek to guide him toward what is right, and there are those who wish to use him for their own gain." The scene shifted, and Jake saw Trump speaking at a rally. His words stirred the crowd, their faces filled with a mixture of hope and division. The image changed again, showing Trump in a private moment, seated at a desk with his head in his hands. Papers were scattered around him, and his expression was one of deep contemplation. For the first time, Jake saw not just a public figure, but a man carrying immense pressure. He felt a pang of empathy, his heart softening. "What can I do about this?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jesus placed a comforting hand on Jake's shoulder. "You can remind the world of what truly matters: faith, humility, and vigilance. No leader is perfect, and none can succeed alone. It is up to the people to pray, to guide, and to hold their leaders accountable with love and truth." Jake nodded slowly, trying to absorb the enormity of what he was being shown. But what if they don't listen? What if they don't believe me? Jesus knelt to meet Jake's gaze, his eyes filled with understanding. Do not underestimate the power of truth spoken with courage. Even a single voice can ignite change. Your role is not to force others to believe, but to plant the seed. The rest is in their hands and in God's. The scene shifted again, and Jake found himself standing in a shadowy landscape, far darker than anything he had seen before. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and filled with an eerie silence, broken only by faint whispers. The shadows moved like living things, curling and twisting along the ground. "What is this place?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Jesus stood beside him, his presence a beacon of light in the darkness. This is what happens when vigilance is lost, when people allow themselves to be divided, when they place power above principle. This darkness grows. Jake's heart raced as the whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of anger and despair. He saw families torn apart, leaders consumed by greed, and communities shattered by fear and hatred. At the center of it all was a swirling void, a mass of darkness that seemed to feed on the chaos. "Is it too late?" Jake asked, tears streaming down his face. "No," Jesus said firmly. "Light can overcome even the deepest darkness, but it requires faith, courage, and unity. The choice begins with each individual." Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance, small but unwavering. Jake focused on it, and as he did, the whispers began to recede. The light grew stronger, and within it, Jake saw people coming together, helping each other, praying, and standing united against the encroaching darkness. "This is what happens when people choose faith," Jesus said. "Even the smallest acts of kindness and courage can push back the shadows." Jake felt a spark of hope ignite within him. He wiped his tears and stood taller, his fear replaced by determination. He didn't know how he would share this message, but he knew he had to try. The light around them grew brighter, enveloping Jake and washing away the shadows. He turned to Jesus, who smiled warmly. "Be strong, Jake, and remember, you are never alone." As the vision faded, Jake felt himself being pulled back, the world around him dissolving into a swirl of light and motion. The journey wasn't over, but he knew his mission had just begun. The world around Jake shifted again, and the light that had comforted him moments ago was replaced by a suffocating darkness. It wasn't like the peaceful void he had first entered. This darkness was alive, pulsing with a menacing energy. The air felt thick, pressing against his chest, and the silence was broken only by faint, distant whispers, voices filled with malice. Jake tried to move, but the ground beneath him seemed unstable, shifting with every step. Shadows writhed and twisted around him, creeping along the ground like living tendrils. Fear clawed at his heart, but he clenched his fists and reminded himself of Jesus' presence. "I'm not alone," he whispered, though his voice sounded small and frail against the oppressive darkness. As if in response to his fear, the shadows began to take shape. Figures emerged, distorted and grotesque, their faces twisted in anguish and rage. Some were unrecognizable, but others looked eerily familiar. Leaders and public figures Jake had seen on the news, their expressions warped by greed and pride. He saw people shouting at one another, their anger feeding the growing darkness. Entire families were torn apart, their once loving bonds shattered by division and distrust. At the center of it all was a swirling void, an abyss that seemed to draw everything into its depths. The whispers grew louder as Jake approached, transforming into a cacophony of despair and hatred. He covered his ears, but the noise seemed to come from within him, vibrating through his very soul. "What is this place?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "This," Jesus said, appearing beside him in a burst of light, "is the cost of turning away from the light. When people allow fear, hatred, and pride to guide their actions, this darkness thrives. It feeds on division, on selfishness, and on the loss of faith." Jake's gaze was fixed on the void, his stomach churning as he watched the shadows grow larger, consuming everything in their path. He saw entire communities swallowed by the darkness, their once bright lights extinguished. The sight was overwhelming, and Jake felt his knees weaken. He wanted to look away, but an unseen force kept his gaze locked on the horrifying spectacle. "Is this what will happen?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. "It is what can happen," Jesus replied, "but it is not inevitable. Light can overcome even the deepest darkness, but it requires faith, courage, and unity. The choice begins with each individual." The figures in the shadows grew more distinct, and Jake recognized familiar faces among them. Some were leaders he had seen on TV, their expressions consumed by ambition and greed. Others were ordinary people, their faces etched with bitterness and despair. Jake's chest tightened as he realized the darkness wasn't some external force. It was born from within, fed by the choices people made every day. Jake turned to Jesus, his eyes filled with tears. "How do we stop it? It's too big, too powerful." Jesus knelt beside Jake, his eyes full of compassion. "Do not underestimate the power of faith, Jake. Even the smallest acts of kindness and love can push back the shadows. When people choose to stand together, to forgive, to love, the darkness loses its power." As Jesus spoke, a faint light appeared in the distance. It was small, barely noticeable at first, but as Jake focused on it, the oppressive darkness seemed to recoil. The light grew stronger, illuminating the landscape around them. Jake saw people coming together, helping one another, standing united in prayer and reaching out with compassion. The shadows retreated, unable to withstand the light's warmth and strength. "This is what happens when people choose faith," Jesus said. "Even in the darkest times, hope can shine through. But it requires vigilance. The darkness will always seek to return, and it is up to each person to guard their hearts and their communities." Jake felt a spark of hope ignite within him. He wiped his tears and stood taller, his fear replaced by determination. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "I'll tell people what I've seen. I'll remind them to stand together, to choose love over hate." Jesus placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, and the warmth of his touch filled Jake with strength. "I chose you because of your heart, Jake. Never forget that even the smallest light can shine brightly in the darkest of places." The shadows around them began to fade, replaced by a growing light that washed over the landscape. The oppressive weight that had pressed on Jake's chest lifted, and he took a deep breath, his lungs filling with a sense of peace and purpose. The scene shifted once more, and Jake found himself standing at the edge of the swirling void. He could still feel its pull, the temptation to give in to fear and despair. But he stood firm, his gaze fixed on the light that now shone brightly in the distance. "What if they don't listen?" Jake asked, turning to Jesus. "What if no one believes me?" Jesus smiled gently. "Do not measure your success by how others respond. Your task is to speak the truth, to plant the seeds of faith and hope. The rest is in their hands and in God's." Jake nodded, his resolve growing. He didn't know how he would share this message or where it would take him, but he trusted that he was being guided by something greater than himself. As the light around him grew brighter, Jake felt himself being drawn back, the world dissolving into a blur of colors and motion. The darkness was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and purpose that filled his heart. Jesus' voice echoed softly in his ears as the vision began to fade. "Be strong, Jake, and remember, you are never alone." With those final words, Jake felt a pull, a gentle yet insistent force, drawing him back to the world he had left behind. The journey wasn't over, but he knew his mission was just beginning. Jake woke with a gasp, his lungs heaving as if he had been underwater for far too long. The blinding light of the world he had just left was replaced by a harsh, fluorescent glare. The rhythmic beep of a heart monitor filled his ears, grounding him in the reality of a hospital room. Pain shot through his body like a wave, sharp and unrelenting, reminding him of the fall. He blinked against the brightness, his vision blurry and unfocused. Voices swirled around him, distant at first, but gradually sharpening into words. "He's awake," someone exclaimed, their tone laced with relief. Jake turned his head slightly, his muscles aching with even the smallest movement. His mother's face came into view, her eyes red from crying, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clasped his hand. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, thank God. Thank God you're okay." His father stood at the foot of the bed, his usually stoic expression crumbling as he placed a reassuring hand on Jake's leg. "We thought we lost you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The doctors weren't sure." Jake tried to speak, but his throat was dry and the words wouldn't come. His mother quickly brought a small cup of water with a straw, guiding it to his lips. He sipped carefully, his mind racing to process everything. The fall, the light, the visions, Jesus. It all felt as real as the room he was now in. But how could he explain it? How could he put into words what he had experienced? The weight of the message he carried pressed heavily on his chest, but so did the uncertainty of how to share it. "Don't try to talk," his mother said softly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Just rest." Jake nodded weakly, his eyelids growing heavy as exhaustion overtook him. The journey back to his body had left him drained, and despite the urgency he felt, he needed time to recover. Days passed, and Jake remained in the hospital under careful observation. The doctors were amazed by his resilience. "It's nothing short of miraculous," one of them said, shaking their head as they examined his charts. "He fell from that height, and yet here he is, alive and healing faster than we could have predicted." His parents hovered nearby, their relief palpable. But Jake's mind was elsewhere. He replayed the visions over and over, the words Jesus had spoken echoing in his thoughts. He knew he had been given a second chance for a reason, and the urgency of his mission grew with each passing day. One evening, as the sun set and bathed the hospital room in golden light, Jake decided it was time to speak. His parents were seated beside his bed, holding his hands as they often did during their visits. He looked at them, his throat dry but his resolve firm. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. His mother leaned in closer, her eyes wide with concern. "What is it, sweetheart?" Jake took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "When I fell, I didn't just black out. I went somewhere. I saw something." His father frowned slightly, his brow furrowing. "Jake, you've been through a lot. Maybe it was a dream. Or..." "It wasn't a dream," Jake interrupted, shaking his head. "It was real. I know it was real." His mother's grip on his hand tightened as tears welled in her eyes. "What did you see?" Jake hesitated for a moment, then began recounting everything. The light, the figures, meeting Jesus, and the visions of both hope and despair. He spoke about the crossroads the world was facing, the warning of division and darkness, and the importance of faith and unity. Finally, he shared the vision of Donald Trump and the role Jesus had described for him. His parents listened in stunned silence, their expressions shifting from disbelief to wonder as Jake poured out his heart. When he finished, the room fell quiet for a long moment. "Jake," his mother said softly, her voice breaking, This is incredible. But are you absolutely sure?" Jake nodded firmly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Jesus told me I have to share this. People need to know." His father, usually a man of few words, placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. His eyes were filled with both skepticism and a quiet admiration for his son's conviction. "If this is what you believe, Jake, then we'll stand by you, whatever it takes." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. He didn't know how the world would respond to his story, but knowing his family believed in him gave him the strength to move forward. Over the next few days, Jake began writing down everything he had seen and heard. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to capture the vivid images and powerful emotions in words, but he pressed on, pouring his heart into each sentence. He knew this was the first step in fulfilling the mission Jesus had given him. When the time came for Jake to leave the hospital, his parents helped him into the family car, their concern still evident in the way they hovered around him. But Jake felt stronger than he had in days. As they drove home, he stared out the window at the familiar streets, the weight of his task pressing down on him once more. He couldn't waste this second chance. He couldn't let fear or doubt hold him back. The world needed to hear what he had seen, even if it meant facing ridicule or disbelief. When they arrived home, Jake sat at his desk, the small notebook he had started in the hospital open in front of him. His father walked in and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this all at once," he said gently. "Take your time." Jake looked up and smiled. "I know, Dad, but I feel like I don't have time to waste. There's so much to do." His father sighed, then handed him a small, well-worn Bible. "Whenever you feel overwhelmed, remember where your strength comes from." Jake took the Bible, its leather cover cool against his hands, and nodded. "Thanks, Dad." As the sun set outside his window, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Jake opened the Bible and whispered a prayer. He thanked Jesus for the second chance he had been given and asked for strength to carry out the mission ahead. This was just the beginning. The small living room buzzed with conversation as Jake's family gathered with close friends and neighbors. Word of his miraculous recovery and near-death experience had spread quickly through their small town. Though Jake had barely been home for a week, the community was eager to hear his story, and Jake insisted on sharing it in person. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" his mother asked, her hand resting on his shoulder. She had been protective since the accident, her worry etched in every glance she cast his way. Jake nodded with quiet determination. "I have to do this, Mom. It's important." His father gave him an encouraging pat on the back. "We're here for you, son. Just speak from the heart." Jake stood at the center of the room, a mix of nerves and resolve coursing through him. The faces of friends and neighbors stared back at him, some filled with curiosity, others with skepticism. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "When I fell, I thought that was it," he started, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "But something happened, something I can't explain in any way except to say it was real. I went somewhere. I saw something." The room fell silent as Jake recounted his experience. He spoke about the glowing light, the figures of love and warmth, and meeting Jesus. His voice wavered slightly as he described the visions he had been shown, a world at a crossroads, divided by fear and hatred, yet brimming with hope and potential. He told them about the swirling darkness and the light that had pushed it back, about the choices every person must make to stand against division and choose love, unity, and faith. Finally, he shared the vision of Donald Trump and the pivotal role Jesus had shown him the former president would play in the times ahead. Some listeners sat riveted, their expressions reflecting awe and emotion. Others exchanged skeptical glances, whispering quietly among themselves. Jake noticed their doubt but pressed on. He wasn't speaking to convince. He was speaking to share, trusting that the truth would resonate with those who were ready to hear it. "It's not just about leaders," Jake said, his voice gaining strength. "It's about all of us. Every single one of us has a role to play in pushing back the darkness. It starts with how we treat each other, with love, kindness, and faith." When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Jake's grandmother, her eyes glistening with tears, stood and embraced him. "I believe you," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Her words seemed to break the dam. Others began to speak up, sharing their thoughts, their own struggles, and their hopes for the future. That night marked the beginning of something much larger than Jake had anticipated. Word of his story began to spread beyond his small town. People invited him to share his experience at schools, churches, and community centers. His parents, ever cautious, worried about the strain it might put on him. "Are you sure this isn't too much?" his father asked one evening as Jake prepared to speak at a local church. "This isn't about me, Dad," Jake replied, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "It's about the message." At each event, Jake stood before larger and larger audiences. He spoke with sincerity, recounting his journey without embellishment or hesitation. People were drawn to his authenticity and the simplicity of his message. He didn't claim to have all the answers, nor did he try to dictate how others should live. Instead, he encouraged his listeners to reflect, to pray, and to act with integrity in their own lives. One evening, Jake was invited to speak at a regional youth conference. The event was held in a sprawling auditorium, and as Jake stepped onto the stage, the sight of hundreds of faces staring back at him made his heart race. But he remembered Jesus' words, "You are never alone." The fear melted away. Jake began to speak, pouring his heart into every word. He described the vision of light and darkness, emphasizing how even the smallest acts of kindness could push back the shadows. He urged the audience to pray for their leaders, particularly those in positions of great influence. "They're just people," he said, his voice steady. "They need our support, our prayers, and sometimes our courage to remind them of what's right." After his speech, Jake was approached by dozens of young people. Some shared their struggles and asked for advice. Others simply thanked him for giving them a renewed sense of purpose. Jake listened to each of them, offering encouragement and a reminder of the power they held to make a difference. The impact of Jake's message began to ripple outward. News outlets picked up his story, framing it as an extraordinary tale of a boy who had returned from death with a message of hope and warning. Some journalists treated it as a miracle, while others dismissed it as the product of a vivid imagination. Jake didn't let the skeptics faze him. He knew his mission wasn't to convince everyone. It was to plant seeds of change. At home, Jake continued writing in his notebook, chronicling every detail of his journey and the thoughts that came to him as he reflected on his mission. One night, as he sat at his desk, his father walked in and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing something important, Jake," his father said, "but don't forget to be a kid too. It's okay to take breaks." Jake smiled and nodded, appreciating his father's concern. "I know, Dad, but I feel like there's so much to do. I don't want to waste the chance I've been given." His father sighed and handed him the Bible he had given him earlier. "Whenever you feel overwhelmed, remember where your strength comes from." Jake took the Bible, running his fingers over its worn cover, and nodded. "Thanks, Dad." As the weeks passed, Jake's story continued to inspire people far and wide. Communities began organizing prayer events, families reconnected with their faith, and conversations about love, unity, and vigilance spread like wildfire. Jake knew he was just one voice among many, but he also knew that even a single voice could ignite a movement. On one particularly quiet evening, Jake stepped outside to gaze at the stars. The vastness of the night sky reminded him of the glowing light he had seen in his vision. He whispered a silent prayer, thanking Jesus for the strength to carry on and asking for guidance in the days ahead. This was only the beginning of his journey, but Jake felt ready. With faith as his guide and love as his message, he knew he could help others find their way back to the light. Jake's story spread far beyond the small town where it had begun. What started as quiet gatherings at local churches and community centers soon grew into invitations to larger events. News outlets picked up on his tale, describing it as the extraordinary account of a boy who returned from death with a powerful message. Some reporters treated it as a miracle, while others framed it skeptically, questioning whether it was the product of trauma or a vivid imagination. Jake wasn't fazed by the attention, positive or negative. He hadn't set out to be believed by everyone. His mission was clear: to share the truth he had been shown and to encourage others to reflect, pray, and take action. He reminded himself often of Jesus' words, "Plant the seed, the rest is in God's hands." The turning point came when Jake was invited to speak at a national youth conference held in the capital. The venue was unlike anything he had ever seen, an enormous arena packed with thousands of young people from across the country. Jake stood backstage, his heart pounding as he peered out at the crowd. The sheer size of the audience was overwhelming, and for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. "What if they don't listen?" he whispered under his breath, clutching the small Bible his father had given him. But then he remembered the warmth of Jesus' presence, the strength in his voice when he said, "You are never alone." Jake closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. The fear melted away, replaced by a quiet resolve. He stepped onto the stage, the bright lights casting a glow across the sea of faces. Jake began to speak, his voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. He shared the story of his fall, his journey to the light, and the visions of hope and despair he had been shown. He spoke about the swirling darkness that fed on division, fear, and hatred, and the light that pushed it back through acts of love, unity, and faith. When he reached the part of his story about Donald Trump, the audience grew particularly quiet. Jake described the vision he had seen: Trump standing at the center of a room, surrounded by advisors and strangers. He told them about the burden Trump carried, the weight of decisions that rippled across the world, and the importance of guiding leaders with prayers and love. "He's not perfect," Jake said, his voice steady. "No leader is, but they're human, just like us. They need our support, our prayers, and sometimes our courage to remind them of what's right. If we let division and fear take over, the darkness wins. But if we stand together, even the smallest light can shine through." When Jake finished, the crowd erupted into applause. But what struck him most wasn't the applause. It was the conversations that followed. Young people approached him, some with tears in their eyes, sharing their own struggles and fears about the state of the world. Others expressed gratitude, saying Jake's words had reignited their faith or given them a new sense of purpose. Over the weeks that followed, Jake's story reached a global audience. News programs aired segments about him, and social media lit up with posts about the boy who claimed to have seen the future. Some people celebrated his message, organizing prayer groups and community events inspired by his words. Others were skeptical, dismissing him as a child seeking attention or the victim of a traumatic experience. Jake didn't let the criticism bother him. He focused on the people who were listening, the ones who felt moved to take action. He received letters and emails from all over the world, stories of families coming together, friendships being mended, and individuals finding hope in difficult times. One day, Jake received an unexpected invitation, a request to speak at a gathering of faith leaders and influential figures in Washington, D.C. The event was meant to address growing concerns about division and unrest in the country, and Jake's message of unity and faith had caught the attention of the organizers. Jake felt a mix of excitement and nerves as he prepared for the event. This was the largest stage he had been invited to yet, and the audience would include not just ordinary people, but leaders with significant influence. His parents accompanied him, offering quiet words of encouragement as they traveled to the capital. The event was held in a grand hall, its high ceilings and ornate decorations a stark contrast to the simple community centers where Jake had started his journey. As he stepped onto the stage, he was struck by the seriousness of the faces staring back at him. Politicians, religious leaders, and business executives, all seated in rows of gleaming chairs. Jake took a deep breath and began to speak. He told them about the visions Jesus had shown him, emphasizing the importance of faith, humility, and vigilance. He urged them to remember their responsibility as leaders, to guide with love and truth rather than fear or ambition. "You have the power to make choices that ripple across the world," Jake said, his voice unwavering. "But no leader can succeed alone. It's up to the people to stand together, to hold their leaders accountable with love, and to pray for guidance in these challenging times." The audience listened intently, their expressions unreadable. When Jake finished, the room erupted in applause. But it wasn't the applause that mattered to him. It was the hope that his words might plant seeds of change in even a few hearts. After the event, Jake was approached by several leaders who thanked him for his courage and honesty. One man, a well-known pastor, shook Jake's hand and said, "You're wise beyond your years, young man. Thank you for reminding us of what truly matters." Jake left the event feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew his journey wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about sparking conversations, encouraging reflection, and inspiring action. As Jake's story continued to spread, he found himself juggling the responsibilities of his mission with the simple joys of being a kid. His parents made sure he took breaks, encouraging him to spend time with friends and enjoy the ordinary moments of life. Jake cherished those moments, but he never lost sight of the message he had been entrusted to share. One evening, as Jake sat on the porch of his home, staring at the stars, his father joined him. "You've come a long way," his father said, his voice filled with pride. "But remember, Jake, you don't have to carry this alone." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude for his family's support. "I know, Dad, but I feel like I was given this chance for a reason. I can't let it go to waste." His father placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm yet comforting. "You're doing something important, Jake. Just don't forget that even the smallest light can make a difference." Jake smiled, his eyes fixed on the stars. "I won't forget," he said softly. "Not ever." The anniversary of Jake's fall arrived with a quiet sunrise, the sky streaked with hues of gold and crimson. It had been a year since that fateful day, and while his life had changed dramatically, Jake found himself drawn back to the rooftop where it all began. The building stood as it always had, weathered and worn, yet steadfast against time. "Are you sure you want to go up there?" Jake's father asked, standing at the base of the ladder. Jake nodded, gripping the cold metal rungs. "I need to. There's something about this place. It feels like closure." His father sighed but stepped back, allowing Jake to climb. With every rung, memories flooded his mind. His friends' laughter, the thrill of adventure, and the instant his foot slipped, sending him hurtling into the unknown. When he reached the top, he stood still for a moment, letting the wind tug at his hair. The view was just as breathtaking as he remembered. The town spread out below, like a patchwork quilt of familiarity. Jake stepped to the edge, the same spot where he had lost his balance. This time he stayed far enough back to feel safe. Closing his eyes, he whispered a prayer. "Thank you, Jesus, for giving me a second chance. Thank you for trusting me with your message. Help me to keep going, even when it's hard." The wind seemed to carry his words upward, a quiet promise shared between Jake and the heavens. He opened his eyes, a deep sense of peace washing over him. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was just another step. Back home, Jake sat at his desk, staring at the stack of letters and emails that had accumulated over the past year. People from all walks of life had reached out to him, sharing how his story had touched them. Some wrote about mending broken relationships, others about finding faith after years of doubt. Jake read each one carefully, feeling a renewed sense of purpose with every word. He raised his hands and spoke, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is where it all started," he said, "but it's not where it ends. The message Jesus gave me isn't just for me, it's for all of us. Together, we can make the world brighter. Together, we can push back the darkness." The crowd responded with a resounding cheer, their unity a testament to the power of faith and love. Jake stepped back from the edge, his heart full as he joined his family on the ground. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues, Jake stood with his parents, his friends, and his community. He didn't know what the future held, but he felt ready to face it. With every step he took, he carried the light of his mission, a reminder that even the smallest spark could illuminate the darkest night. Jake whispered a final prayer as the first stars appeared in the sky. "Thank you, Jesus, for guiding me. Help me to keep going, to keep sharing your message, and to never lose sight of the light." The journey wasn't over, but Jake knew he wasn't walking it alone.